God chose them, and He is omniscient. He knows that those 7 churches represented the church through the ages.
Welcome, everyone, to podcast number 224, Renew Your Mind. With us today, we have Senior Pastor Paul Gruenberg with his slippers on. We have Pastor Jeremy Touroo. We have our praise band leader and youth and family director, not Jeremy, but Jordan Kettlewell. Yep. Myself, Dana Hall, as moderator. We also have a very special guest, Cindy Miller. And she's created a Bible study on Revelation. And so we've asked her to be part of our podcast as we go through different themes of the book of Revelation. So we stopped at the last podcast about the messages or the letters to the 7 churches. And we wanted to discuss that in a little bit more detail. So who would like to kick us off in that?
I want to kick off with just the initial question of, there's these 7 churches, which we know are in modern day Turkey. Why are these specific churches important?
God chose them, and He is omniscient. He knows that those 7 churches represented the church through the ages, and He went around them. I have a chart in my Bible study on them, but there's also a chart showing the 7 churches and the era of history that it represents. It's after the 7 churches of chapters 2 and 3.
Can you just tell us in your own words, just high level that for us?
Yeah, because what's fascinating when you read through those is they are a perfect representation of issues that you'll find in churches, in churches all over the place in the body of Christ. There are strengths. Yep. There are churches that are doing these things, certain things well, but they're falling short in a certain area. And in every one of the churches of these 7 churches, really you can see modern day examples of that. At any given point in history, you'll find you'd find examples of
each of the churches.
Those kinds of churches and what issues needed to be addressed.
Tell us more about them. Some, you can just pick one of the churches. What were they getting? I don't want to say scolded for, but
so there would be a pattern. There would be a pattern to each church. So we'll just take the first one, verse 4 of chapter 2. Why don't you start there, Cindy? First church is Ephesus in chapter 2, verse 1.
Right, and that represents the apostolic age, which was from 33 AD to 95 AD. Smyrna represents the persecuted church. It's a second church in chapters 2, verses 8 through 11, and it represents the Roman emperors who persecuted the church from 95 AD to 313 AD. Pergamos is the sharp two-edged sword, and it's the compromised worldly church, which was the Middle Ages, 313 AD to 500 AD. That's where the church would tend to compromise with the world because the world was persecuting the church. So they would compromise. Thyatira is in chapters 2, verses 18 to 29, and it's the idolatrous worldly church. And it's considered from 500 to 1517 AD until the Reformation. That was during the time of indulgences and the Inquisition and the Crusades and things like that persecuted the church. And the church became idolatrous and worldly. Sardis is considered the dead worldly church. And it is during the Enlightenment, which was from 1517 AD to 1793. So that was in the period after the Reformation, when the church became dead and worldly. And then the Philadelphia church is in chapters 3, verses 7 through 13, is the church that spread the gospel. And that's the missionary church. Begin with the Open Doors Missionary Church in almost 1800, 1797, until the 1960s, during peace and love and all of that, the hippie generation. And then the Laodicean church in chapters 3, verses 14 through 22, is the lukewarm church. And that's considered the apostasy to the rapture. And that's today's church, where they teach health, wealth, and happiness and all of that in the church, and until the end.
So the word that gets used for the Laodicea church is that it's lukewarm.
Right.
It's neither hot nor cold. And that Jesus says he'll spew you from his mouth.
Right.
So with that, there were two churches or two ages that you're referencing, Smyrna and Philadelphia, where there wasn't any rebuke.
Why?
So what happened in the Smyrna church? It talks about they suffered persecution and poverty, and the action is don't fear, be faithful. But there was no rebuke to that church. What was that church age?
That was the second church age, from during the time of the Roman emperors, from 95 AD to 313. So for about 200 years.
Yeah, and that's when the church greatly expanded, from the time of Jesus to the disciples to the greater church. So now one of the questions that people might ask for these 7 letters regarding different church ages. Ages, because you don't see that in the actual book of Revelation. You don't see it saying that this church represents this age.
Right. It doesn't say that.
So who came up with that concept? Do you know?
I'm not sure who came up with it. It may have been McGee or one of those, one of the early church fathers. I'm not sure who came up with it, but this timeline of, chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation are the 7 churches, and those 7 churches are in modern day Turkey, which was then Asia Minor. And that was the churches that represented these lampstands. So only the second church was the persecuted church, and the next to last church, Philadelphia, was the missionary church. So those churches were the ones that spread the gospel.
So Cindy, what would you say to people, because this is one of those areas where people will disagree. Some people would say these churches represent church ages, and other people would say these were just churches that existed when John wrote this letter. These were what the angels said for John to write down about these churches. So what would you say to people who believe that these are just churches that existed during those times, and it doesn't represent any real church age? It just represents what different churches were going through at that time, and that these churches represent what churches go through today. Different churches will be lukewarm. Some will be immoral. Some will be compromised. Some will have a deep first love for Christ. That all of these kinds of churches exist today. What would you say to people who kind of have that slant?
Every kind of church exists in every age. Okay, so every kind of church exists in each age, but those ages, those eras are only predominantly what the church is predominantly at that time.
Okay.
In history, but it's not representative of all of the churches. All of the churches are represented in all of the ages.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, moving on, there's in chapter 4, there's a worship of God in heaven. What's the importance of that regarding the worship of God in heaven in chapter 4?
Okay. The worship of God in heaven is only Christ is worthy to open the seals. And the worship of God in heaven is John comes to heaven and he sees these, the Christ, the glorified Christ in chapters 1. Now, chapters 4 and 5 expand on that, but it says only Christ is worthy to open the seals in chapter 6 because he is worthy. But a lot of people think 4:1 is a reference to the rapture, but I don't believe it is. I believe it's just a preliminary intro, and then it expands on it later in chapter 11.
Yeah, and 4 verse 1 says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me was like a trumpet said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.'" And so if they're interpreting that as a rapture, this would be what we might understand as a pre-trib rapture.
The English-speaking world believes in the pre-trib. So pre-trib is basically an English-speaking concept. It's not in the world generally.
So when we talk about, because we're moving toward rapture, John Darby back in the, was it late 1700s, somewhere in the 1800s, had really spent a lot of time with this pre-trib rapture idea. Not that it didn't exist in the church father age, which would have been after the apostles had died, but it was John Darby that made it more popular, brought it to the forefront, and then Charles Ryrie got a hold of it from John Darby. And of course, Charles Ryrie was a pretty well-known preacher back in the day. And the evangelical church took a hold of what is called a pre-trib rapture. Now, a rapture is simply that moment in time when Jesus calls all Christians from earth who have either died in the past, their bodies rise up from the grave, or Christians who are living at that time, and he draws them up into heaven, or they're raptured into heaven. And one of the thoughts in the pre-trib rapture is that the tribulation period is a time of tribulation. There's pain and there's suffering, and who wants to avoid that, right? And it seems like the evangelical church, John Hagee, some of the evangelicals really grasped this pre-trib rapture and made it real for everyone. And so the idea being that if you are raptured before the pre-tribulation period, you're going to escape any pain or harm or suffering or potential death. But that's where pre-trib comes from. And I would I would disagree with it personally, simply because when I was looking at Revelation some time ago, it can be confusing. And I said, well, who would know how this is really supposed to work out? And I thought to myself, well, Jesus does.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you go back to Matthew, Mark, or Luke, specifically Matthew chapter 24, he talks about the end age. And there isn't anything in Jesus's discourse about the end times where he talks about a rapture happening before the seals, the trumpets, or the bowls of wrath, or anything like that. So I think there's a unhealthy desire for a pre-trib rapture, because one of the scriptures says, during the tribulation, the faith of most will grow cold.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a part of that stems from the fact that people will think, as the tribulation plays out, as everything gets a little bit more difficult, there's suffering, the mark of the beast, the mark in order to buy or sell, that we'll be living into that. And people will say, well, where's Jesus? Where's the rapture? And so their faith will be challenged because Jesus hasn't come back, because they've been holding too tightly to this pre-trib rapture idea, and their faith will grow cold.
Yeah. Well, I am pre-wrath.
Say again?
I am pre-wrath. I believe that there is a difference between persecution of the Antichrist and persecution of God. That the Christian is promised not to suffer God's wrath, but we do suffer the wrath of the Antichrist.
And in that's something, that's a theme that carries throughout the New Testament, that the devil has authority over the earth. And so we're already in a time where we can experience persecution, strongholds, different kinds of suffering, because the devil has access to us now. And in that's a theme that carries from the time of Christ. I mean, he was tempted 3 times in the desert, and then you see him working through providing miracles of people who are under persecution, have strongholds in their life, or sickness. And so we see this theme from the time of Christ on, well, actually, since the time of Adam and Eve and the fall. So to expect to be raptured before this last 7 years is, I think, a mistake or a misnomer. And it's just a desire to escape persecution.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. It could be true. I don't think we know for sure. But I think going back to what you said earlier, too, the early church fathers and the early saints, and even Protestant reformers, Luther and even Wesley, they did not have much to say about a pre-trib rapture.
No.
It seemed to develop later than the early church.
Right.
And even the Protestant Reformation.
So,
Yeah.
Good point. Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up right there. Thank you for everyone for joining in. We're going to continue and probably 2 or 3 more podcasts on Revelation. So if it seems confusing, come on back so we can keep talking through this. So anyway, we come to you from the Gaylord Methodist Church. We have 2 services on Sunday. We have a 9 a.m. traditional and a 10:45 contemporary. We also have on Wednesdays, 2nd and 4th of the month, we have a Encountering God service, a little more casual, more question-answer format. We'd love to have you join us in person. If you can't, you can join us via YouTube or Facebook. If you have any questions, you can call our office at 989-732-5380. You can Google us. We'd be happy to help answer any question. And just a reminder, we have a chili cook-off on February 9th, so mark that on your calendars. So we look forward to our next podcast, continuing our discussion on Revelation. Thanks, everyone.